Lush, and I'm here in Davos, really pleased to be joined by Karl Hofmann, President of Population Services International. I'd like to talk about health, West Africa. If we take Ebola as a starting point, what's working in the fight?
Thanks, Edie. Great to be here. So obviously you see this impressive reduction in the number of new cases in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. That's great news. And I think that is testimony to the fact that the international community eventually mobilized, that national governments there stood up and took leadership, and then a lot of old lessons that we already know about public health, about tracking individual cases, contact reporting, and so forth, were applied. That's the good news. The bad news is that people assume it's over, or virtually over. And in reality, this sort of dynamic requires you to really go down to the last known case. Those last hard yards, you can't lose focus in public health issues.
So I'm interested, if we look at Ebola, there's been a lot of talk in the United Kingdom about the drugs and speeding drugs through the kind of the normal process, the vaccines, exactly. So what's your thought on that? Is that a good thing? Has Ebola been good for that?
I think it has been good for that. I mean, that's another interesting aspect of drug development. Huge money goes into drug development, vaccines. We know big pharmaceuticals are needed to do that. But if you look at things like Ebola or TB, an old killer around the world, they don't tend to generate great markets that justify the investments. So public policy figures have to be creative about how we get the resources in place to do those sorts of investments. And I think Ebola has caused people to think about that anew, because you look at that as a real threat that has to be dealt with, even if there isn't a market that will justify the investment.
And how does it work? How do you think what's the best combination of public-private money in that sense?
Well, I wouldn't give you an exact figure, but you hit on the right concept, which is partnership. I mean, you absolutely need the private sector. We work a lot with the private sector in our business, even though we're nonprofit, because the private sector, particularly in Africa, is a way a lot of health consumers get their health care. The public sector is weak and doesn't work so well. So you need the private sector approach, but you need the public sector to set the policy agenda, to own the framework, and to guide people's investments. Those two elements are really important.
So those two elements are important. Another issue I know you are interested in is reproductive health. Some countries, the government wants nothing to do with it though, right?
Well, I mean, the challenge of demography is that it can be a huge opportunity for societies that embrace a growing youth population. The right investments can lead, for example, in education and training and workforce development, can really give you a bump in GDP growth. Governments should care about that. But if you don't have the right investments in place, then a rapidly growing population can be a real strain on society. And that's bad for women, it's bad for their families, it's bad for their societies, their cultures, it's bad for their economies. And even you have figures, like the Pope recently talking about, in his own way, about the need to recognize the limits. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but people struggling with how to manage the reproduction and the rate of reproduction. Women ultimately need to be given the control to do that.
Just quickly, to finish off, are you optimistic about that? Do you feel like it's getting better?
I am optimistic about that. I mean, there are huge challenges in that area and in development in general. But you look at the progress over the last 50 years, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, child mortality half what it was 20 years ago. These are tremendous times of progress. We just have to figure out how to take advantage of this.
Thank you very much for stopping by the Hub Culture Pavilion here in Davos, and I'm Edie Lush.